Hello, gentle students, gentle readers of the novel Hongloumeng, Dream of the Red Chamber, also called Ji, or Story of the Stone. This is going to be a rather short series of lectures, each lecture being more or less 20 to 30 minutes long, sometimes slightly longer, slightly shorter. And the lectures are intended really to introduce you to what is perhaps my favorite piece of fiction, written by an 18th century intellectual by the name of Cao Xieqin, who wrote plays and was quite gifted at writing poetry, was a painter, enjoyed imbibing in a little of the more spirited beverages in China. There's much to say about this particular novel, and today I'll just fundamentally introduce you to our approach, or my approach. But let me begin with one little thought, and that is to read the novel Dream of the Red Chamber is to undertake a rather large venture. If you begin to read the novel, and everyone should read this novel in my estimation, the novel will not happen overnight. It takes a while. It requires work. The best English translation in my mind is by David Hawkes, and the translation that he provided is in 5 volumes published by Penguin. But I should begin too by saying that whenever one undertakes to read something in translation, one is both reading the text and not reading the text. That is, the best way, not the only way, but the best way to read a work such as Dream of the Red Chamber is to read it in its original language. And the investment of learning to read Chinese is quite demanding for those who need to start from the beginning. This is the version that I have here. Hongloumeng, there is the Shang, the first section, and Xia, the second section here. This is the, in my mind, one of the clearest and easiest to read versions of the text. But there are other versions of the work. This is the David Hawkes. These are 4 volumes of the David Hawkes edition, translation. I've read these several times, as you can tell by the very tattered nature of these volumes. These were new when I first purchased them when I was a college student so long ago. But there is an Italian saying, and the Italian saying is traduttore traditore, and it means the translator is a traitor. There is no getting around the reality that when one translates a text, the text that one translates must be changed to make sense to the reader who is not reading in the original language. To go from Chinese to English is a rather vast sweep of space. One traverses continents to get it from the original Chinese to the English. For example, Dream of Red Chambers. Well, this almost is nonsensical to the English reader. Hongloumeng, Hong, red, building, dream. Well, these, the first and the last character alone, are so laden with meaning that it would take pages of footnotes to describe the connotations. Red is quite a meaningful color in the context of Chinese culture. Buddhist thought would call it the color of dust, the color of things that it's the dust that gets on your clothes and it doesn't go away easily. It's the distractions of the world. Meng is a dream. Dreams are interesting things in that they, if one meditates upon them, they somewhat problematize the question or our level of comfort when thinking about what is true and what is false. So there is much that will happen in the next several lectures that will maybe challenge the Western notion of reality a little bit, but also realize that no matter what we do, if we read it in translation, we won't access it completely. But that said, you can still access the novel reading it in translation. I think David Hawkes really does the best job of translating the novel, and one can access it quite well. The one thing I will say is this series of lectures will be almost meaningless unless one actually reads the novel. So the following lectures are for those of us who read it, and so I do recommend that you get a copy and read. If you can read Chinese, read the original Chinese. If you read English or another language, read it in your native tongue. So welcome again to this series of lectures. Our goal is to begin a journey into 18th century China by setting an intellectual framework for these series of lectures. History, in my opinion, I'm a historian, but also trained in classical Chinese literature. In my own training, I've read a great deal of classical Chinese and late imperial Chinese and some modern. I've read anything from the Luoyu, the Analects, to the Mengzi, the Hanfeizi, the Shunzi. Certainly have read the Tang poetry and the Chuzi and the Shijing, and one moves forward in time through the Tang and the Song, reading texts from those eras and Ming Dynasty novels such as Shui Hu Zhuan, Outlaws of the Marsh, and Jinping Mei, Plum in the Golden Vase, and then Hongloumeng, Dream of the Red Chamber, and read Lu Xun and other modern writers. So I'll try to set these lectures into a certain framework. That is, as a historian, I believe that history really is about people. It's about real lives. And I think that history, if we can't access the real lives of people, then all of the accounts of dates and events really mean little. We need to know how this affects humanity. So in this class, in this series of lectures, we will spend our time reading a very strange but a very fun Chinese novel. We'll be looking at China through the lens of its literary history through these lectures, looking most specifically at what late imperial Chinese thinkers were mulling over in their minds. What were intellectuals thinking, mostly Buddhists and Taoists and Confucians? How were they thinking about, well, the questions of reality? The largest questions that are asked, I think, in the novel Hongloumeng are the questions that we ask ourselves today if we think much about existential things. If we are thinkers, if we are people of the mind, we should ask the question, what is truth? We should also then ask the question, is there one? And then, of course, we should ask the very powerful question after asking the question of truth is, why am I here? And how can I know that I'm even here? These are basic questions, especially in Buddhism. And so let me begin with a quote from the novel that begins in the very first chapter of the novel. 假作真实真亦假 无为有处有幻无. Now, that's almost impossible to translate in my mind, but David Hawkes translates it sensibly as truth becomes fiction when the fiction's true, real becomes not real when the unreal's real. Let me read Hawkes' translation again of that little, that couplet, as we say. Truth becomes fiction when the fiction's true, real becomes not real when the unreal's real. So any good reader would ask, what is this all about? There's always been a suspicion regarding truth, both in the West and in China. Plato's dialogue, for example, between Socrates and Meno. In this dialogue, Plato pits the two against each other in a discourse about the nature and origin of virtue. But really the dialogue centers largely about the nature of truth. But Plato asks the question, well, in the words of Socrates, can virtue be taught to all human beings? And do all human beings share virtue? And does it consist of one quality or several? Socrates sets out to demonstrate that knowledge is innate, that we know things, that we know truth from birth. That is, we know virtue innately as we know truth innately. Meno is a sophist from Thessaly and probably holds a more relativistic view of truth. But among other points, Socrates sets out to establish the existence of an ultimate and transcendent truth. This is not something that we find within the Chinese tradition, certainly not in the same way. The philosophical definition of truth, if we think about the Western tradition, is that which remains always the same, that which is immutable. Socrates uses math and geometry to argue that there is such a thing as truth. Another example is Pythagoras, especially in his Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, a squared plus b squared equals c squared is a formula that is true. It is always the same. Even if the sun supernovas and none of us exist, the Pythagorean theorem would still hold true. Now, but in China, there is a totally different notion of truth. And one of the things that we can explore through reading this novel is how the question of truth, how the question of life, of existence, is confronted in this way of thinking. That would be the late Imperial Chinese way of thinking. I'm thinking of Zhuangzi, the early Taoist, who wrote a series of essays that I'm extremely fond of. My one professor, when I was a student so many decades ago, once asked the class what each person would take with her or him if she or he were stranded upon a small island and could only read one book. Well, this is a challenging question because for religious reasons, one might choose her or his canonical text. Yes, of course, that makes sense. But if one wants to read a text just for the pure intellectual delight of the text itself and the ideas that are confronted and played with in a playful way, I think I would want to take maybe more than one text, but certainly among the texts I would bring with me on this small island would be the Zhuangzi. Well, Zhuangzi, in a chapter that's often translated as Autumn Floods, he sets up this dialogue. Prince Mo of Wei speaks with a sophist by the name of Gongsun Longzi. But in any case, what happens in this passage in the Zhuangzi is that a frog that lives in a very tiny well, with the walls going upward and the bottom of the well is filled with water. The frog learns from a sea turtle of the small reality of the well. So the frog thinks that his well is the entire cosmos. But then he encounters a sea turtle who tells him that there is more to reality than his small well. Well, the frog, of course, is crestfallen because he realizes that his small reality is indeed his small reality. For Zhuangzi, we cannot know the complete truth because we are all frogs, captive in our small, tiny water wells. We're deluded in a way, according to Zhuangzi, by our arrogant assumptions that we know everything. One person who's holding a cup, for example, across the room. For that person, the cup would be this cup. For the person across the room, it would be that cup. For Zhuangzi, there is a difference between this cup and that cup. Everybody, every person has her or his own position and location. Now, let me back up. I don't think that what Zhuangzi is suggesting, because he's thinking a lot about truth, right? What Zhuangzi is suggesting isn't that there is no truth. I think what Zhuangzi is suggesting is that we live in a confined state wherein we cannot access the entire truth. Well, I mean, too, if you think about another passage, the very, very famous Hudie, the butterfly passage in Zhuangzi, where Zhuangzi dreams that he is a butterfly, and in his dream he's flying hither and thither as a butterfly, and when he awakens, he asks himself, am I this person? Of course, Zhuangzi's name is Zhuangzhou. Am I Zhuangzhou, or am I the butterfly? Am I Zhuangzhou dreaming that I'm a butterfly, or am I the butterfly dreaming that I'm a person? And those lines between the dream state and the waking state, Hongloumeng, Dream of the Red Chamber, the dream part of the novel is we cannot separate it from the question of Zhuangzi. Am I really the person of the dream, or the thing of the dream, or am I the person outside of the dream? But even, let's think about time. Time is envisioned differently in different cultures. As I was preparing these notes for this lecture, it struck me that in the West we think of time as from left to right. In Arabic, it's left to right. I'm sorry, it's right to left. So in the West you have time left to right. In Arabic you have right to left. And in China you have, 上次 下次, you have top to bottom. So you see various ways of thinking about time, and I printed something that is a curious thing called the so-called Necker cube. If you look at the Necker cube, here's, I'll hold this up and you can sort of glance at this. But if one looks at the Necker cube, the Necker cube shows that you can view the corners from more than one angle. We often choose, according to the Chinese way of thinking, we often choose to view things as we want them, or in ways that place us in a position of correctness, even if we're incorrect. Why do we prefer, for example, as I was pondering this, why do humans prefer to see solar eclipses more than we prefer to see sunsets? I, in recent years, was able to be present for a solar eclipse. And yes, it was interesting and rare, but I should say a sunset is spectacular and far more beautiful than a solar eclipse. But somehow, because the solar eclipse is unusual, we seem to prefer it, even if a solar eclipse is in many ways, I guess according to me, rather dull. And then, I just wrote on the chalkboard here the sentence, the blank ran into the bank. Well, if you were to read the sentence, the blank ran into the bank, what would one assume by filling in the blank? I often ask my students to do this exercise. Ask them to write down what they imagine. Some of them say a person ran into the bank. That would be a bank where one would deposit checks and withdraw money. Some students write the animal ran into the bank, or the car ran into the bank, assuming that blank space was something that ran into a bank, a dirt bank. Bank has two meanings. And then when one asks the question, what comes to mind when I say, he put a check in the box? Well, some students, if I ask them to write down what they think is meant by he put a check in the box, some people think that they put a check in the mailbox. Some students think that this person put a check inside the box on a file, a form. Well, most of us, myself included, can recognize that the question of assumption, the question of truth, the question of my own limited space is a good question, and it's a question that allows us to be, I think, somewhat flexible in thinking about these questions. It doesn't challenge any notions of, for example, the religious notion of revelation or revealed truth. And I personally don't find that to be a necessary problem. But when thinking about these questions that 60 to 70% of the world, which would be Asian, question that culture has often allowed to be more flexible. In my mind, perhaps even sometimes too flexible. Certainly, I probably could say that I very much resonate with Aristotle, but there's that. But there are two, I think, in my mind, two extremes that I personally deny. The two extreme intellectual conclusions involving the nature of truth that I set aside. One would be nihilism. Nihilism, the standard to verify facts is so high that nothing is possible, that nothing is true. And postmodernism, the standard to verify facts is so low that everything is possible, everything is true. So let me outline them again. Nihilism and postmodernism are things that I personally find easy to reject. They're too extreme. Nihilism is the idea that it's the standard to verify facts is so high that nothing is true. And postmodernism is the standard to verify facts is so low that everything is true. I've already suggested that, at least in the Aristotelian notion, probably in Platonic system too, that truth is defined as that which does not change. Well, let's think about this from a Buddhist point of view. Since everything we see that exists is constantly changing, nothing we perceive is constant. Thus, according to Buddhism, all we see is untrue. This is the Buddhist view. This is essentially a view that the novel Dream of the Red Chamber will play around with, but ultimately will always pull back from, just before going entirely into the Buddhist camp. But according to this Buddhist notion of truth, there is no truth because there is nothing that is constantly unchanging. One can say that change is constant. The Buddhist notion would be, and I think the notion that Cao Xueqin, the author of Dream of the Red Chamber, might at times suggest in the novel that we're trapped in an illusion. We're all trapped in an illusion. And we must be shaken from our attachment to the little wells that we live in as little frogs and see the ocean beyond the walls. Sometimes it's important that we escape our small confines and see that there is a larger world. The novel we'll be reading throughout these lecture series is in large part all about asking these rather big questions. What is truth? And, what am I here for? And these questions are very much asked, I think, from the Chinese point of reference. When I teach courses, I often try to encourage my students not to necessarily change their mind about their own beliefs or thoughts, but to at least, at minimum, try to imagine another intellectual way of thinking about the same question. And this is something that really you must do if you read Chinese literature. Reading. Let me encourage you. I began with gentle reader, which is something one often finds as an opening to Chinese literary works. The reader is quite frequently addressed by the author. So there is a relationship we all must acknowledge between the reader and the writer, that once one writes something, the reader will be engaged with the writer's ideas and thoughts and words, as long as those thoughts, ideas, and words are in print, or whatever mode one is reading. But you can either imagine reading as a type of suffering. It's not easy to read, especially something great. I think the greatest things are often difficult. And what is our suffering? Our suffering can either make us bitter, or our suffering can make us better. And you have to choose whether your reading, it's worth reading the novel, will make you bitter. Oh, this is a lot to read, or better, because it's just plain old worth it. Well, there's a lot to be said. I'll end with just a few thoughts. One of the things that we see in Chinese poetry, and you'll hear about poetry in the upcoming lectures. One of the things about Chinese poetry is it's deep, it's profoundly beautiful. And even in the sort of Judeo-Christian notion, especially the medieval Christian notion with Thomas Aquinas, who I'm personally very fond of, there is this idea that beauty is tantamount to truth. That beauty is truth. And in China, there's the same notion. Beautiful language suggests a kind of truthfulness. Chinese poetry is beautiful. The text of Hongloumeng is beautiful. Well, my advice is read often. Find a very beautiful place to sit and read, because reading beautiful words in a beautiful place is always more pleasurable. The Chinese novel, just to end, the Chinese novel really emerged as a genre, the so-called novel. There's no word novel in Chinese. The word they use is 小说, which is how we translate the word novel. The word 小说 is what the Chinese that we often translate as novel. But the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, you start to have what we think of as the novel emerging, with really 4 great Ming novels. And then in the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1911, you have the novel continuing as a genre of writing. The most famous novel of all, certainly, is Hongloumeng in China. They're called 小说, which means small talk, to set them aside from quote-unquote more important works, right? More important printed works, such as the Confucian classics. Although I should say that the 小说, the novels, these small talk, insignificant writings, were written by people who were trained in the Confucian classics, and they're highly complicated and very, and within the narrative is an embedded message that only someone trained in the classics could accomplish. Well, there is a novel tradition that emerged from Buddhist didactic storytelling and late popular storytelling. Storytellers used to go into the streets in China, and they had these huaban, these prompt books, and they would tell a story in the street. And as they would tell the story, they would get to a particularly suspenseful moment, and they would stop and pass a hat for donation, and they would say something like, "If you want to know what happens next, stay tuned and make a donation." Well, that habit of street storytelling and stopping at a suspenseful moment and addressing the hero of the story, "If you want to hear what happens next, stay tuned," that is something that you see in the novel. If you want to know what happens next, you will have to read to the next chapter. And then the other thing I will say, by way of just giving you a hint as to how to begin, know that every chapter begins with some couplets, 2 lines, and those couplets give you a hint as to what will happen into that chapter. Well, to all of you who are watching, 祝你们身体健康, I wish you very good health, and 不知有何来世，且听下回分解. If you want to know what happens next, stay tuned until the next posting. 干杯.